December the 7th, 1941, is a day that lives in infamy. This was the day that the Empire of Japan attacked the headquarters of the United States Pacific Fleet, forcing their entry into World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history. Yet, as time passes, mysteries surrounding Pearl Harbor become far more apparent in the public mind. For simple questions like, what is the history of Pearl Harbor itself, to more complex details like, where did Japanese spies hide on the island? How did the island's radar system work? And what became of all the ships that were targets of the attack? Stay tuned to find out, as today we expose the secrets of Pearl Harbor. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start with the context. During the 1930s, when Japan was expanding its empire by force, issues arose following several diplomatic conflicts with the Allied powers in the West. The first of these was the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in 1905 when the United States brokered a peace deal between the Japanese Empire and the Russian Empire. Japan, as the victor, felt cheated out of their rightful winnings when the United States negotiated a lenient peace deal with the Russians. This was the first of many perceived slights from the United States, which both the Japanese public and government viewed in an increasingly negative light. One of the final straws with the Western powers was the condemnation of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which caused Japan to withdraw from the League of Nations. While the United States was not a part of the League of Nations, the message was clear: there would be no peace. However, there was an issue. Japan did not have the raw materials needed to wage a modern war, which lay squarely in the possession of the Western powers. While the United States and Japan had poor relations, they were still warm enough to remain trading partners. That changed after the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, when Japan committed countless atrocities against the Chinese during their invasion. This was enough to swing public opinion in the West against Japan, and for the United States to cut them off from purchasing military goods altogether. And by 1940, with the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, or modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the United States cut off all shipments of goods except for oil, for fear that cutting oil supplies would anger the Japanese enough to act against them. After the fall of France to Germany, Japan fully occupied French Indochina, and the United States finally cut off the oil supply to their nemesis. In response, Japan invaded the oil-rich Dutch colonies in Indonesia, but they were mindful, as they knew this could be met with a threat reaction from the United States. While negotiations continued, they eventually proved fruitless, and 6 days after the final proposal was delivered on November the 20th, 1941, a Japanese naval task force left for Oahu Island, intending to target Pearl Harbor. But here's the twist. Japan feared the United States since the turn of the century, and accordingly, they sent some spies to gather vital intel. The Japanese military did not send the task force without preparation, however. War with the United States was considered by the Japanese High Command as early as 1907, and Japan's Naval War College produced an early version of the plan for an attack as early as 1936. By early 1941, the plan for a fierce destruction of the United States main fleet at the onset of the war was put to training, with the hopes of deciding the naval war on the very first day. Key to this intelligence, the strike force needed to know what they were getting into before the attack went ahead. One of the primary figures in this operation was Takeo Yoshikawa, a 28-year-old Japanese spy arriving in Hawaii on March the 27th, 1941, and he managed to evade the authorities by living under the alias of a Japanese diplomat. He worked to collect as much information on the Pearl Harbor naval base as possible. His most common method of gathering intelligence was sightseeing, where he dressed in plain clothing and investigated as much as he could about the base. He took notes about Ford Island, the center of the naval base, and the various structures on and surrounding it. Ford Island itself features an airfield and accommodations for warships, particularly battleships. It was and remains the center of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. The water of the base is divided into 3 bodies of water: West Lock, Middle Lock, and East Lock, with Ford Island being the centerpiece. Yoshikawa observed battleships moored on the east of Ford Island, with aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers grouped on the west side of the island. He reported to Tokyo on May the 26th that Pearl Harbor facilitated 6 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, and several other vessels, ranging from destroyers to submarines to oil tankers. Pearl Harbor also featured docks, shipyards, and dry docks for repairs. And it's important to point out that Pearl Harbor did not just station naval forces. It housed a division of troops from the U.S. Army, 300 aircraft, petroleum storage tanks, and more. Now, I could go on and on about that, but if you're into military equipment, you should absolutely check out the sponsor of this video, Enlisted, a new kind of first-person shooter that uniquely couples person versus person with person versus environment combat. You'll take command of a squad of customizable AI soldiers and fight massive battles with hundreds of targets led by other players as you explore multiple campaigns to play through. Featuring unique weapons, vehicles, and equipment from the outskirts of Moscow in 1941 to the heart of Berlin in 1945. As a history buff, I was really impressed by the amount of historic vehicles featured in the game, like the Panther G or Tiger II, but you don't have to be a historian to enjoy the game. It's approachable for all audiences, and due to the more realistic movement and target-rich environment, casual players still serve an important role on the battlefield. So take advantage of key features, from over 100 weapons, tanks, and aircraft, to incredible graphics and details. Enlisted is available on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, as well as PS4 and Xbox One, with cross-platform support. There's no purchase necessary, so follow my link in the description below, download, and play for free. There's a free bonus pack when you register with my link, including multiple weapons, soldiers, and a 3-day premium account. Thank you, Enlisted, for supporting the channel, and now, back to the secrets of Pearl Harbor. Another fascinating but overlooked aspect of Pearl Harbor is that the Navy had a dedicated industrial zone on the shore of the island. To maintain secrecy, the Japanese ordered him to report on the vessels in Pearl Harbor once every 10 days, through the diplomatic cables. Any more frequent than that, and the reports risked being intercepted. Both he and the Japanese government were unaware that the Americans had cracked the code of their messages, but the Americans did not give them much attention. Yoshikawa also rented airplanes at a nearby airport, taking notes on the American implements as he flew. He also dove under the harbor looking for any submerged defenses. By September, the Japanese government had divided Pearl Harbor into 5 water zones: A, from Ford Island to the Navy Industrial Zone; B, from the southern tip of Ford Island across its western flank; C, East Lock; D, Middle Lock; and E, West Lock, which included a runout to the sea. To better gather and distribute information, he worked closely with Bernhard Kuhn, a spy from Nazi Germany. As the day of the attack drew closer, the Japanese requested Yoshikawa report daily, even if there was no activity. He was also informed of a code to be broadcast through the weathered radio station that would act as his signal to destroy all of his documents: east wind, rain. On the day of the attack, he received that signal and destroyed all of his documents, mere minutes before he was placed under house arrest, when in the meantime, some very unusual things were noticed on the base's radar. Part of the defenses of Pearl Harbor were SRC-270 early warning radars. Introduced into the military service in 1940, they were initially difficult to get working. Pearl Harbor's commander, General Walter Short, was slow to adopt them, showing little interest in setting up an air defense system. In fact, there may not have been any kind of air defense system in place were it not for the Major Kenneth Berquist, who had experience with coordinating air defense systems. Once the equipment to set up the radar arrived, Berquist was one of the only men present who understood what they were and spearheaded the initiative to build a control center. The first SRC-270 radars at Pearl Harbor became fully functional in July of 1941, only having a small team of operators. By November, there was a ring of 4 radars around Oahu and 1 extra in reserve. 1 radar was placed on the northern shore of Haleiwa. There was 1 set up on Opana Point, and then another at the southeast corner of Koko Head. And finally, a radar was set up at the highest point in the island, Mount Kala. The radars started with no communication systems or reporting chain. The closest communication they had was a phone at a gas station that could be used to issue reports in the place of any command center. The commander in charge was no help either, ordering the radars to only operate for 4 hours a day and to be shut down entirely by 7 a.m. Despite this inefficient setup, the radar team continued. At 7:02 a.m. on December the 7th, Private George Elliott and Private Joseph Lockard detected an enormous formation of 180 planes on the radar, 132 miles out. Lockard called his supervisor and couldn't reach him. The only person they could contact was Private Joseph P. McDonald, who had just taken the previous shift on the radar. From there, McDonald was able to contact a U.S. Army Air Corps Lieutenant, Kermit Tyler, who wrote off the detection as a B-17 formation coming from the continental United States, urging him not to worry about it. McDonald intended to contact Wheeler Air Force Base despite the lieutenant's order, risking being court-martialed for insubordination. However, a sergeant was currently using the orderly tent, meaning that a message couldn't go through. He told his tent mate about the incoming planes, just minutes before the Japanese airplanes rushed overhead and attacked Pearl Harbor. McDonald's tent mate found his warning message balled up in a trash can and copied it word for word in a notebook before authorities could take it for an investigation, marking down December the 7th, 1941. And they detected a, quote, great number of planes coming in from the north. After the attack, authorities celebrated McDonald for his initiative and attempted warning, and commented that if his message had gone through, the airbase may have had enough time to mobilize a response and reduce the impact of the attack altogether. The Naval Board of Inquiry found that Lieutenant Tyler had been assigned to the Radar Intercept Center with insufficient training, no supervision, and no staff to work with. In August of 1942, they cleared them of all wrongdoing, considering that he was assigned to the wrong post and at the wrong time. In our previous videos on Pearl Harbor, we went into detail about the 2 sunken vessels, the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma. However, there were many more ships present during the attack, and many of them rebounded and returned to operation. We'll start with USS Nevada, designated BB-36. Just behind USS Arizona during the attack, Nevada was not moored to another battleship, making her unable to maneuver, unlike the other 7. Nevada's gunners were able to open fire on the incoming planes, managing to shoot down one of the attack planes just as it dropped a torpedo and tore into the ship's keel. She was able to counter the list of the ship with counterflooding, and as the damage control crew took charge of the situation, the gunners shot down 4 more planes. Then, during the second wave of attacks, Nevada was a key target. She was positioned ahead of the rest of the ships, and had she sunk in that position, she would have obstructed the harbor, making it much more difficult to access. She was struck by 5 bombs, one over the cruise galley, another hitting the upper deck, and yet another striking a turret and blowing holes in the upper main decks, and 2 more striking the forecastle on the main deck. Nevada intended to travel to the west of Ford Island, but grounded off Hospital Point, shooting down 3 more planes before breaching. Gasoline fires made damage control difficult, but counterflooding kept her stable. The attacks claimed the lives of 60 of Nevada's crew and wounded 109. Even so, she was refloated and repaired at Puget Sound Naval Yard, as well as overhauled with modernizations so she would fight again. Another battleship present at the Pearl Harbor attacks was USS California. Moored on the southeastern side of Ford Island, she was at the back of Battleship Row. As the attack began, California's guns opened fire on the incoming fighters, quickly going through their ammunition. The torpedoes struck her, one at the front of the ship and another at the back. Despite the holes torn below the armor belt, the torpedo bulkheads held and contained much of the flooding. However, the watertight doors were opened for inspection as the attack began and were in the process of shutting when the torpedoes struck. The ship took on water rapidly, causing her to list to portside. The torpedoes also ruptured the fuel tanks, causing those to flood with water. More bombs were coming, damaging her further. Despite this, the crew restarted 4 of the boilers, restoring power to the ship. As smoke flooded through the engine room, the men inside were forced out, ending the efforts to fight the fire, though other ships aided in firefighting after the attack ended. California settled into the mud at the bottom of the harbor, slowly filling with water. The attack claimed the lives of 104 of her crew and wounded 61. Despite the grave damage, California was salvaged and refloated. After an accidental explosion caused yet more flooding, she was dry docked for repairs and then traveled to Puget Sound for permanent repairs and modernization. By February of 1944, California was back and better than ever, ready for action. The attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most infamous days in American history, with good reason. It's one of the few times where the United States suffered an attack on her home soil. As a result, it is a deeply complex topic where mysteries breed mysteries. We've only just scratched the surface, so I would love to hear what other mysteries you've come across in the comment section below. And thank you Enlisted for supporting the channel. Click the link in the description to play for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, and act now to receive your free bonus pack. Otherwise, thank you all for watching and subscribing. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.